The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Marian had always thought was the cruelest day of the week, too far from the weekend to offer any comfort, too early in the month to pretend things might still turn around. She read it twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table of her rented room in Edinburgh and looked out the window at the gray November street below and thought, so that is how it ends. The letter was from a solicitor named Mr. Hawthorne, representing the estate of her late uncle, Sir Bertram Ashfield. It informed her in the careful language that men use when they wish to soften an injustice without actually apologizing for it, that the entirety of Ashfield Park, the house, the grounds, the tenant farms, the timber rights, the family contents, all of it, had passed to her cousin Percival Ashfield under the terms of a revised will dated 3 weeks before Sir Bertram's death. 3 weeks. Marian had spent the better part of her 26 years understanding that the world was not built for women like her, women who had opinions, women who had read the wrong books and asked the wrong questions and refused, at various points in their lives, to smile convincingly enough. She had understood this with her mind. She had not, until that Tuesday, understood it with her body, the specific weight of it, the way it settled in her chest like something waterlogged. Ashfield Park had been her mother's home. It had been promised to Marian when she was 12 years old, her uncle's hand on her head at her mother's funeral, his voice very low. "It will always be yours, child." She had believed him. That was the thing she could not forgive herself for. Not the loss of the house, the belief. Percival had wasted no time. By December he had installed himself at Ashfield, brought his solicitors down from London, and begun selling off the smaller paintings. By January he had let go of most of the household staff, people who had worked those rooms for 20 years, and replaced them with his own people from the city. It was Mrs. Daventry, the old housekeeper, who wrote to Marian in February, not asking for anything, just to say that the East Wing was being closed off and that someone had removed the portrait of Marian's mother from the main hall, and she thought Marian ought to know. Marian read that letter 4 times. Then she wrote back to Mrs. Daventry and asked a single question. The position was for an under-housekeeper at Dunmore House, the estate of the Duke of Cavenhill, situated in the Borders country south of Edinburgh. It was not a position Marian would have ordinarily sought. She had no experience in service. She had a governess's education, a good hand, and a memory for detail that bordered on inconvenient. But these were not qualifications that appeared in Mr. Hawthorne's letters. What she had was a name, not her own, a borrowed one, arranged by Mrs. Daventry through a chain of quiet favors that Marian would spend years repaying. The name was Sinclair, Marian Sinclair, with references from a house in Perthshire that no longer existed, and a letter of character written in a hand that was, in fact, Marian's own. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she only needed access to the estate records. Ashfield's accounts were managed through a banking house, with connections to several northern properties, and there was a paper trail, if she could find it, that she believed would show her uncle had not been entirely himself in those final weeks. The solicitor Percival had used had a reputation. It was the kind of reputation that was spoken of only in certain circles, in certain tones. She needed time. She needed proximity to people who moved in those circles. Dunmore House was, by several accounts, a place where such people gathered. She did not let herself think too carefully about what she was doing. The house appeared out of a February mist as the hired cart crested the last hill, long and gray and serious, set against a sky the color of old pewter. Not beautiful, exactly, but permanent, the kind of building that had seen things come and go and expected to see more. The housekeeper who met her at the servants' entrance was a tall woman of about 50, with a face that gave nothing away. Her name was Mrs. Holt. She looked Marian over for a long moment. Marian had dressed carefully, not too well, not too poorly. She had pulled her hair back more severely than she usually wore it and left off the pearl earrings her mother had given her. "Your references are in order," Mrs. Holt said at last. "I will say plainly that I had 3 other applicants. I chose you because your letter was written by someone who actually thinks. We have enough people in this house who do not." "Thank you," Marian said. "Don't thank me yet. His Grace is not an easy employer. He has no interest in being one. What he requires is that the house run without requiring his attention, and that when he does pay attention, he does not find anything wanting. Do you understand the distinction? I think so. Most people say that and don't." She turned. "Come." The Duke of Cavenhill was not, in the first weeks, much in evidence. Marian heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the corridor above, a voice giving instruction to someone in a tone that did not invite discussion. She heard the staff speak of him in the careful way people speak of weather, not complained about because complaining was futile, but mapped. He traveled to Edinburgh on Tuesdays. He disliked the dining room used for anything other than dinners of 8 or more. He read until 2 in the morning and would ring for tea at 1, and heaven help the person who forgot. She caught her first real look at him on a Thursday afternoon when she was crossing the main hall with a set of linen inventories, and he came down the main staircase without warning. He was taller than she had expected, with the kind of face that had been arranged by nature into an expression of permanent assessment. Not unkind, not warm. Somewhere in the early 30s, she thought. Dark hair. Eyes that moved across a room the way you moved across a chessboard, noting positions. He glanced at her once. "You're the new under-housekeeper. Yes, Your Grace, Mrs. Holt says you're competent." "I hope to be." "That's a careful answer." He didn't stop walking. "I prefer careful answers to confident ones. Confidence is frequently the last resort of people who haven't thought things through." He was gone before she had formulated a response. Marian stood in the hall a moment longer than she needed to, then went back to the linen inventories. She thought, "He is more complicated than I was expecting." She thought, "That is not necessarily useful information." The trouble began in March, and it did not begin with the Duke. His name was Mr. Aldous Wickfield, and he arrived at Dunmore House on a Friday afternoon with 2 cases of luggage and a smile that Marian disliked on sight. He was a business associate of some kind. She gathered this from fragments of conversation, from the way Mrs. Holt's posture shifted slightly when his name was mentioned. Not fear. Something more like the alertness of someone who has learned to watch a particular weather pattern. Wickfield was perhaps 45, well-dressed in the way that men are when they have spent money recently on things they want people to notice. He had the habit of speaking to servants in a tone that was very nearly courteous, with just enough distance built in to ensure everyone understood the gap. It was a precise kind of condescension, the kind that had been practiced. He noticed Marian on the second day. She was in the library, cataloging some volumes that had been displaced in a recent rearrangement, when he came in without knocking and stopped when he saw her. She did not look up immediately. "You're new," he said. "Yes, sir." She kept her attention on the shelf. "What's your name?" "Sinclair, sir. Under housekeeper." There was a pause. She could feel him looking, the way you feel a temperature change. "Sinclair," he said. "Where are you from?" "Perthshire originally, sir." Another pause. Longer. "You carry yourself oddly for a housekeeper." "I was told it was a quality Mrs. Holt valued," Marian said, and finally looked at him and kept her face entirely pleasant. He smiled at that. A small, thoughtful smile that she liked even less than the first one, and left. She stayed very still for several seconds after he was gone, listening to her own heartbeat. He knew something, or he suspected it. She could not tell yet which. The evenings at Dunmore House had a particular quality in that season, long and cold and quiet, with the hills outside pressed against a sky that faded slowly from gray to a dark that was almost blue. Marian would sometimes stand at the window of the small sitting room allotted to the upper servants and look out and think about Ashfield. The specific smell of the library there, the way the light came in at 4 o'clock in winter through the west-facing windows. The portrait that was no longer in the hall. She had found one thing since arriving, a single ledger entry passed to her by a contact in Edinburgh who moved in banking circles, suggesting that 3 payments had been made to the solicitor Percival used in the months before Sir Bertram's death. Not from Percival, from Wakefield. She did not yet know what the payments meant. She knew they had been made. She kept this piece of paper folded inside the cover of a book in her room, a small, battered copy of Persuasion that no one would think to open. And she did not take it out very often because looking at it made her feel both closer to something and more afraid of it. On a Tuesday in late March, the Duke found her in the garden. She was not supposed to be there. It was her evening off, and she had gone out simply to breathe cold air, which was the only thing that helped the particular kind of headache she got when she had been reading fine print for too many hours. He was walking the path that ran along the south wall, which she had not known was a thing he did. He stopped when he saw her. She straightened and began to excuse herself. "You don't have to," he said. "It's your time off, I expect." "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment in that assessing way he had. "You read." It wasn't a question, exactly. She had left a book on the bench, Persuasion as it happened, the copy with the ledger entry inside. She felt her pulse do something involuntary. "I do," she said. "What are you reading?" "Austen, Your Grace." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but in the neighborhood of it. "Which?" "Persuasion." "Apt," he said, almost to himself, and then seemed to notice he'd said it aloud and looked briefly annoyed with himself. "Carry on, then, Sinclair." She watched him walk away and tried to determine what precisely had just happened. Wakefield moved against her in April. She learned about it indirectly, which was perhaps worse, not a direct accusation but a whisper in the right places. Mrs. Holt came to her on a Wednesday morning with a face that was doing considerable work to remain neutral. "There are some questions," Mrs. Holt said, "about your references." Marian sat very still. "What sort of questions?" "The house in Perthshire. Someone has looked into it more closely than I did." She had been prepared for this in the abstract. She had not been prepared for the specific sensation of it. The floor seeming to shift slightly, the way the light in the room looked suddenly too bright. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "I need to tell you something." She had intended to tell only what was necessary. She told considerably more. She was not certain why. Perhaps because Mrs. Holt's face had the expression of someone who had suspected there was more to the story and had been patiently waiting. Perhaps because Marian had not told anyone anything true in 4 months and the weight of it had become considerable. She told her about Ashfield, about the revised will, about the solicitor and the payments and the folded piece of paper inside Persuasion, about Percival, and about what she believed Wakefield's connection to all of it might be. Mrs. Holt listened without interrupting. When Marian finished, the housekeeper was quiet for a long moment. "You've been carrying this alone since February," she said at last. "Yes, that's a great deal of weight." "Yes." Mrs. Holt stood. "I am going to tell you something, and you are going to sit with it before you react. His Grace has known for several weeks that your references were not entirely what they appeared." Marian felt the room tilt. "He said nothing," Mrs. Holt continued, "because, and I am quoting him, anyone who could write that well and organize a linen inventory that thoroughly and give Mr. Wakefield that particular look in the library deserved the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise." She paused. "He is not a man who extends benefits of the doubt as a general practice." He asked to see her that evening. The study at Dunmore House was a room that suited him. full of books that were clearly read rather than displayed, a fire that had been burning long enough to have settled into real warmth, two chairs placed in a way that suggested they were used by actual people for actual conversations rather than arranged for effect. He was standing when she came in. He gestured to one of the chairs. She sat. "I know who you are," he said, not unkindly. "I know you do, Your Grace Marian Ashfield." Her name in his voice felt strange. She had not heard it spoken. Her real name, in months. "Yes," she said. He sat then, across from her, and she had the sudden strong impression that this was not going to be the conversation she had expected. He did not look angry. He looked like someone who had been working out a problem for several weeks and had recently arrived at something that interested him. "Wickfield," he said. "Tell me what you know." She told him. All of it, this time, the ledger entry, the payments, the solicitor, the timeline. He listened the way he seemed to do everything, completely, without wasting energy on reactions that didn't serve any purpose. When she finished, he said, "The solicitor's name is Hennessy. Yes, I know Hennessy." The tone in which he said this was not pleasant. He has done similar work for other men. There have been questions before, but questions without documentation don't generally go anywhere. She understood then what the piece of paper inside her book might mean to someone with the standing to act on it. "You have it with you?" he said. "Always." She retrieved the book, retrieved the paper, and laid it on the desk between them. He read it carefully. "Read it again." "This is enough to begin," he said. "It is not enough to finish, but it is enough to begin." He looked up at her. She found in this moment that she did not particularly want to look away. "Why did you come here?" he said. "Specifically here, Dunmore House has connections to the banking house that holds Ashfield's accounts. I thought if I could get near those records." "That's the practical reason," he said. "I asked why here." She looked at him. "Because someone told me you were a man who didn't let injustice go unaddressed when it was put in front of him." He was quiet for a moment. "And if I were the kind of man who turned people over to the authorities for using false references, then I would have lost," she said. "I was prepared to lose. I wasn't prepared to not try." Something moved in his expression. It was, she thought, not entirely unlike the look he'd had in the garden when she told him she was reading Persuasion. "I'm not that kind of man," he said. He stood. "I have a meeting in Edinburgh on Friday with someone at the banking house. I'd like you to come with me." "Not as Marian Sinclair." He looked at her steadily. "As Miss Ashfield." The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing was. The paper led to another paper, which led to a set of records that required someone with both legal standing and the willingness to push hard through considerable resistance to obtain. The Duke of Cavanhill was, as it turned out, someone with precisely those qualities. Wickfield realized what was happening in May, when two men from the banking house arrived at Dunmore with rather formal expressions and a great many questions about the timing of certain transactions. He left the house quietly the following morning, which Mrs. Holt observed was the most sensible thing he had done since his arrival. Percival did not go quietly. He disputed every document. He claimed Sir Bertram had been entirely himself in those final weeks. He produced witnesses. The Duke produced better ones, and something more useful. The testimony of a physician who had attended Sir Bertram, and who had until now been given reason to stay quiet. Marian sat in a lawyer's office in Edinburgh on a grey June morning and listened to the case for her own life being made by someone else, which was a peculiar sensation. The Duke sat beside her, not in the position of advocate exactly, but in the position of someone who had no intention of leaving. This distinction felt important, though she could not immediately have explained why. She got Ashfield back in July. Not everything. The paintings Percival had sold were gone, and the smaller farms had been leased to people who would need time to unwind from, and the East Wing had been closed so long that it needed work. But the house. the grounds. The tenant farms that had been in her mother's family for 100 years, the portrait of her mother, found, eventually, rolled up in a storage room in Edinburgh where Percival had apparently intended to sell it and hadn't gotten around to it. She stood in the main hall on a Thursday afternoon in late July and looked at where the portrait would go when it was cleaned and rehung, and she thought about the fact that she had read that letter on a Tuesday in November and not known if she would find a way through. The Duke came to Ashfield in August. He came officially, which was the form these things took. He sent a note asking if a visit would be convenient, which was the kind of politeness that carried a great deal of weight from a man who was not generally known for elaborate courtesies. She had the house open properly for the first time. Fires in the good rooms, the linen Mrs. Daventry had kept in storage all these months aired and put back on the beds, the kitchen stocked. It felt like the house waking up. He arrived on a Tuesday, which Marian had previously considered the cruelest day of the week. She was beginning to revise this opinion. They walked the grounds in the late afternoon, when the light came in low and gold over the hills, and she showed him the kitchen garden that her mother had planted, and the old oak by the south wall that she had climbed as a child, and the view from the east end of the house, where, on clear days, you could see a particular bend of the river that had no name on any map, but that her mother had called, for reasons lost to time, the listening place. He listened to all of it. He did not try to offer anything in return, which she appreciated. She had been told things often enough, and what she needed in that moment was someone who could simply receive what she was giving. "I owe you more than I can," she began. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "What I did was correct. It didn't require payment. It required considerable effort. Effort isn't the same as sacrifice." He was looking at the river. "I had the resources to help. It would have been a particular kind of moral laziness not to use them." She looked at him, the profile of him against the late light, the way he said things precisely, without ornament, and meant every word. "Why did you stay?" she said. "After you understood the situation, you could have made inquiries on my behalf and kept your distance. That would have been sufficient." He turned and looked at her. The expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before, which was notable because she had by then catalogued most of his expressions with the same thoroughness she had once applied to linen inventories. "I found that I didn't want to keep my distance," he said. It was said simply, without apparent effort, in the way that he said things that he had thought about carefully and decided were true. The light was very gold on the water. The house stood behind them, its windows catching the sun. "I read Persuasion again last month," he said after a moment. "I had not read it in some years, and I thought Wentworth should have said something sooner." He paused. "I am trying to learn from that." Marian looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the Tuesday the letter arrived. She thought about the mist on the hills, the morning she came to Dunmore, and the study with the fire, and the two chairs placed like they were meant for actual people, and the way he had looked at her in the garden and said apt, and then been annoyed with himself for saying it. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to hear what you have learned." And in the long, golden, unhurried quiet of that August evening, with the river below and the house at her back and her name, her real name, settled in her own life again. At last he told her,